right, so reproduction part 2. Now we're going to go over the female's anatomy. Everything I'm going to draw out for you and go over, you're going to have to know. Again, consult the lab manual, and it tells you specifically the plumbing and the parts you're liable for. I'm going to draw it out for you. It's going to look like a reindeer with Christmas ornaments hanging from the antlers. I'm just telling you now. Or better yet, think of like a Dodge Ram symbol. Well, there you go. Sex sells, right? So, with this then, for the female, what we have to understand is, again, kind of like with the male, like what would be considered the primary / secondary accessory parts. For the female, the primary parts means those areas that will generate the oocyte, the egg, that will release them, that will allow for fertilization, implantation, and birth. So for the female, we're looking at the ovaries, the fallopian tube, also known as the oviduct, also known as the uterine tube. You got to know all three names. The uterus, and then the vagina. Those are what are called the essential parts. The accessory parts or secondary parts would include things like the labia majora, the labia minora, what's collectively called the vulva, the clitoris. All that's considered accessory. Why? Because they're not 100% essential for reproductive purposes. They're not essential for release of the egg, fertilization, implantation, and then resulting birth. Okay, so picking up in your notes, then we pick it up then where her reproductive cells are going to be made, the ovary. All right, so here we go, reindeer time. So again, females, if you would go to like where your pockets are and go to the high part of your pocket, go down about 2 finger widths, about an inch, inch and a half, and then go in. That's where your ovaries will be located in your pelvic cavity. So let's see, I'll just put one here and put one there. All right, so with this now, understand what the ovary is going to do. Again, like in the male, it's going to create the reproductive cells, and it's also going to make her primary sexual hormone. In this case, it's estradiols, also known as estrogen. Estrogen, as you know, as I said in the previous one, is what's going to give her secondary sexual traits, production of breasts, wider hips, softer features, the ability to menstruate, but it also is going to allow her to balance out electrolytes. It's also, which is again why women go through a cycle, they get swelling in their ankles and things like that, and cramping. It also is, it induces the cell cycle of the cells, which we'll talk about when we finish this and go over the menstrual cycle. All right, so like I did with the testis, imagine I took an ovary out, I pulled it out, and I cut it. Okay, so we have to look at the histology of an ovary. Again, remind me, if I remember after I do this, to put them on canvas for you. All right, so like with the male, you have to understand then the meiosis of the reproduction of the cells in oogenesis. Oo, 2 O's together, is Latin for egg. So it's the creation of hopefully viable egg. Now, again, just like in the male, she's going to have stem cells. So I'll do it over here. She's going to start off with what is called oogonia. Oogonia are her stem cells. She has these while she's still developing in mommy. While still developing in mommy, the oogonia will divide, and when they divide, they're going to make what are called primary oocytes. Okay, so these primary oocytes then stop development, and therefore they stay in stasis till the time of birth, until the menstrual cycle kicks in. So she will then have what is called a primary oocyte. Okay, now that's what you're born with. So that means that ladies, women, for your what you're born with is a finite number of primary oocytes, and you can't make any more. It's done. Roughly on average, the average is anywhere from around, some people say like 200,000, 250,000, upwards of 2 million, meaning half and half in each ovary. If you look at in her reproductive life, say on average between the ages of 13 to 45-ish. Having one menstrual cycle a month, releasing one egg potential each time, she's only going to use up a fraction of that. Specifically, let's go the low end, 200,000. She may use up 45,000, 55,000 of the eggs themselves. Well, where did all the rest go? Well, welcome to menopause. That's whenever they degenerate, get reabsorbed, and your hormones go wee for anywhere from 3 to 10 years, and you end up growing a mustache and maybe some sideburns to boot out. makes it look, more 70s, something nice mutton chops. Joke. No, I'm kidding. However, my aunt, not my aunt that I know, it was my aunt that was the weird aunt that came from Ohio one time. I was told to kiss her and I cried. Like, why? Like, because she has a beard, and I got smacked in the back of my head. That's my daughter, Morgan, by the way. That's, her name was Rhoda. Oh, yeah, that's right. How can I forget that? Anyway.
She sounds like a Rhoda.
Thanks. All right. Nice lady. Sweet lady, though. But, she had mutton chops, and I was just, what the... Anyway. Miraculously, so the next year when I saw her for during the Christmas holidays, they were gone, so... Either shaved or, electrosurgery or I don't know what. But anyway, again, I was 5. That's how scarred I was. But anyway, enough of this. So, in the ovary, okay. So, understand that means that the primary oocytes are going to be the major thing you're going to see in an ovary. When they start to mature, how do they mature? Go back to the previous lecture when I talked about LH and FSH in the male. FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone in both the male and the female, more or less means once it's activated, is going to eventually create gametes. It's going to create the egg, the eventual oocyte, or ootid, I should say, or sperm, active sperm. LH is completely different. In the male, you understand it binds to the Leydig cells to produce testosterone. In the female, LH is what's going to make her ovulate. So it's same hormones, same place where it comes from, same way it's released. But in the male, LH is given off on a much more regular, gradual curve. Whereas in the female, LH will spike and then drop back down. That spike is the day of ovulation, which I'll go over with the menstrual cycle. But anyway, so if I took an ovary, okay, and I cut it, basically it's going to look more like egg-shaped, okay? In that egg, what you would see are smaller cells with little bubbles around them, scattered all around, just all over the place. Those, now the actual bubble itself with the egg in it is going to be called the ovarian follicle, or often called a primary follicle, meaning it hasn't matured yet. At this stage, all these primary follicles are stuck in prophase 1 of meiosis. Basically, they haven't even started meiosis yet. They're stuck in suspended animation. What's going to knock them out of prophase 1? If FSH comes a knockin' and induces them to go through meiosis, then they will start to go through meiosis 1, get through about metaphase 2, and stop. When the woman ovulates, she ovulates a secondary oocyte stuck in metaphase 2. So it hasn't even finished meiosis yet. It's only going to finish meiosis if and when it's fertilized by a sperm cell. So when the sperm cell fertilizes it, it will then finish the developmental process, and then it will undergo fertilization. Roughly about the first third of the fallopian tube is where it will occur. But that takes, roughly, 10 to 18, 20 hours, roughly, okay? But right now, they're stuck in prophase 1, all right? Now, if FSH comes a knockin', it's going to pick anywhere on average 20, 30, 40 of these ovarian follicles at random in an ovary to go, okay, today's your day, go for it. What'll now happen is they start to go essentially through a race, assuming she's not on fertility drugs. If she's on fertility drugs, then they all go just as fast. But usually what happens is that it becomes a race. Who gets to the near stage first, near the date of ovulation? What'll then happen is these primary follicles will swell, and they'll look like a big, huge fluid bubble with a small cell in it. Well, understand, this bubble with the cell in it is called a primary follicle, an ovarian follicle. Inside of it, the little cell is the primary oocyte that's stuck in prophase 1. FSH comes a knockin', it starts to swell with fluid pressure. This whole thing is now called a Graafian follicle. In it now, that primary oocyte has gone through meiosis 1 and now it's stuck in metaphase 2. So now it's not a primary oocyte, it's a secondary oocyte. It's not even a mature egg yet. It's stuck again in metaphase 2. Hasn't gone anywhere yet. Now, once you get to this point, roughly, again, you assume menstrual cycle for average female 28-day cycle, more or less. Day 14 would be day of ovulation. As she approaches day 12, the amount of LH starts to literally exponentially spike in her bloodstream till about day 14. And as fast as it comes up is as fast as it drops back down again. But that spike triggers ovulation. LH makes this Graafian follicle rupture. And when it ruptures, it jettisons the secondary oocyte into her fallopian tube. Why? The oocyte is not a sperm cell. It doesn't have flagellum. There's no means of propulsion. The only way to get it into the fallopian tube is literally violently through a fluid explosion. That's what it has to happen. Now, once this explodes, once the Graafian follicle ruptures, jettisoning the secondary oocyte into the fallopian tube, the remnants are not junk. Luteinizing hormone, which made her ovulate, will then also make it reseal upon itself. And now this bubble, this Graafian follicle, will then look like an empty bubble. But it will then start to turn a yellow tint. That is then called the corpus luteum, in Latin, literally meaning yellow body. Why is it yellow? Because at that point, it starts churning out hand over fist estrogen and progesterone. And those hormones have a yellow tint to them. So therefore, that's why it's called the corpus luteum. Okay? Now, let's just say that she's not pregnant. What'll happen? The oocyte will travel down, not implant, and therefore she'll go through menses, shed the endometrium again, start the whole thing all over again. Well, the corpus luteum's job the whole time was to communicate to her uterus saying, keep intact. We don't know if this thing, meaning the oocyte, was fertilized. We don't know if something's coming down the pipe, so let's just get ready just in case. If it didn't implant, you don't need it anymore. That lining has to come out. So the corpus luteum becomes the corpus albicans. Albicans means white, meaning that it's degenerating, falling apart, which means it can't make the estrogen, the progesterone anymore, which then is going to shove her into the next menstrual cycle, the next menses. That make sense? All right. So now, all that with the ovary. Okay, so let me catch up to my notes here. Good enough. Now, with this, let me go back to the division here. Now, understand, when the male goes through spermatogenesis, we said he had a primary spermatocyte, right? It's going to go through meiosis 1, and he's going to end up with 2 secondary spermatocytes. That's when we were walking in the seminiferous tubule. Then he'll do one more round of meiosis 2, and that means he can get 4 spermatid, 4 immature sperm. Note, a 1 to 4 turnover ratio. Does not happen in a female. In a female, what's going to happen? She's going to start off with the primary oocyte, okay? It's going to go through meiosis 1 while she's in the first phase, the first 14 days of her menstrual cycle, again at random. What will now happen is she's going to create this is a primary oocyte. She'll create a secondary oocyte, as I said, stuck in metaphase 2. And she also makes a smaller little body called a first polar body. Well, how the hell does that happen? Normally, when you think of cell division, when you go through cytokinesis, you normally think I take one cell and I pinch it off to make 2 smaller cells roughly the same volume. That's not what happens in oogenesis. In oogenesis, you get unequal partitioning of the cytoplasm, so you end up with one big cell, one little pee-pee cell. The big cell is the secondary oocyte that eventually can become egg. That little body right there doesn't have DNA in it. It's a first polar body. It's junk, essentially. So she's not getting a 1 to 4. She's getting a 1 to 1 turnover ratio is what she's getting. Now, let's assume the secondary oocyte got fertilized. It'll then go through division, and she'll send up with the immature egg called an ootid. But when that happens, it makes another polar body. The secondary polar body will divide to make 2 more polar bodies. So notice she makes 1 egg, 3 pieces of junk. Again, a 1 to 1 turnover, where the male had 1 to 4. Okay? That's the meiosis in the female. That's oogenesis. Now, let me see then, coming down. I already went through all that. All right, now let's get in the fallopian tube. Now this is when we start to make the reindeer horns, okay? So, when we do this, we're going to make this kind of like finger-like projection covering the ovary on each side. And then we're going to make it into a horn and bring it back to thin. And then come all the way back down. And thin as we come down. All right. Good enough. All right, so there's my reindeer horns, okay? Now, what's going to attach to then is the uterus. So the uterus, picture a pear and turn the pear upside down. So it's going to have a roof to it where it then connects, and then we're going to have this fat portion that's now going to taper down. Oy vey. All right, so it tapers down. That's completely disproportional. I can't do that. Sorry. Let's make it a little bigger. Wow, it's still disproportional, but again, the picture's in your notes, all right?
Imagine it larger.
Yeah, exactly. All right? And then that's going to attach to the vaginal orifice. Okay, so there's the reindeer with the Easter eggs hanging from its antlers. Okay, so again, here we have the ovary. In there, again, what you're liable for is the ovarian follicle, primary oocyte, the corpus luteum, the Graafian follicle, and the secondary oocyte, like I drew out. Okay, so now LH came a knocking. Boom! What happens? The oocyte gets blown into the fallopian tube. Now, the fallopian tube is called, again, 3 names: fallopian tube, oviduct, uterine tube. All 3 are applicable. All 3 are used. So you got to know all 3. Now, the thing about the fallopian tube, it's going to be lined with ciliated epithelium. The whole idea, again, is the egg has no means of propulsion, so therefore the cilia have to beat and draw the egg all the way down, eventually into the uterus. How long does that take? Roughly 72 hours, 3 days. So basically, if you take the fallopian tube and break it up into thirds, that tells you how far it could travel in 24 hours. So it's a very slow river, so to speak, okay? Now, so you have to know the fallopian tube. Now notice the fallopian tube, when it comes to the ovary, it opens up kind of like a funnel, almost like a trumpet. This area where you open up is called the infundibulum. Where we open up is called the infundibulum. Now notice the infundibulum again has these little finger-like projections that go and grab onto the ovary itself. These are called fimbriae. The fimbriae basically is so when the egg is jettisoned, the immature egg is jettisoned in the fallopian tube, you don't want it to go into the space of the abdominal cavity. You want to make sure it goes into the fallopian tube. So that's why you have a funnel basically to collect it, and then you have these little fingers that grab onto the ovary to ensure it makes it into the fallopian tube. Now again, the fallopian tube is lined with the epithelium, ciliated epithelium with mucus cells, goblet cells to move it on down. Other thing you need to know about the fallopian tube, where fertilization has to occur, is here. In the upper third, the distal third of the fallopian tube. Meaning that when this secondary oocyte is jettisoned, it only has 24 hours of viability. Other than that, it can't be fertilized. And like I said, you're only going to go a third in 24 hours. So therefore, the site of fertilization is not in the uterus. It's not anywhere in the fallopian tube, but literally right outside the ovaries where it has to occur. Well, think what this means evolutionarily. When the male ejaculates the sperm, it's going to enter into the vaginal orifice in the uterus. It then has to travel up one of the 2 fallopian tubes, swim upstream all the way to the end, till eventually fertilize the egg. What is she essentially doing with her anatomy? She's weeding out inferior sperm. The things, sperm cells that the head is too big, too small, more than one flagella. The flagella is too long, too short. All sorts of things. They never make it out of the uterus. They're toast. Give it to you this way. On average, when a male ejaculates, roughly you're looking at 250 million sperm. How many actually make it to the egg? 2,000 to 3,000. That's a hell of a drop-off because, again, they're never going to make it out of the uterus. They get stuck. They die. All sorts of things happen. All right, so now, so the upper third, the distal third, is where fertilization is going to occur. Now we're going to move on down into the uterus itself. Now notice then we have the infundibulum here. Then we're going to have the body of it coming down, and then you notice it narrows as it comes down. That's called the isthmus. That you're not liable for. Now we come into the uterus. Now, making sure I don't skip anything important. No. All right. So the uterus again is a pear-shaped, upside down. It's going to have 3 major areas, none of which you have to know except for the last one. This area in the back between the 2 fallopian tubes is going to be called the fundus. That's where the embryo would implant for after fertilization. This whole area that's the body of it is called the corpus, again meaning the body. The part you have to know is where it tapers down to become the top of the pear. It actually makes a fold, and that's going to be called the cervix. So the cervix is now where the uterus attaches to the vaginal orifice. So that's basically the connecting pipe is more or less what it is. Now, the uterus itself, understand, is going to have 3 layers of tissue. Imagine like a beach ball again. The outside layer is the layer, if you like looked at somebody's uterus, like if you did an operation, open it up, the outside layer is going to be called the perimetrium. Unimportant. If you were to strip away that layer of it, you'd have a very thick muscular layer called the myometrium. Myo meaning muscle, and that's what's made of smooth muscle, and that's what allows to facilitate childbirth, to push the little guy or girl out. Also does the cramping during the menstrual cramping as well too. What you're liable for though is going to be the innermost lining. So again, you're going to have this lining on the outside. That's the perimetrium. We don't care about that. We're going to have a layer on the inside of that. That's going to be this muscle layer right there. That's the myometrium. We don't need to worry about that either. However, the layer on the inside of the beach ball, all the way in, that is called the endometrium. The endometrium is where the embryo would implant. That's also would then facilitate gestation going through, meaning pregnancy. If a woman is not pregnant, this layer, you understand, roughly 28 days, is going to be shed during the process called menses. Now, this layer of the endometrium has 2 layers. You have what is called the stratum functionalis and the stratum basalis. The basalis basically recreates the functionalis once you remove the functionalis. So when a woman has her heavy days, like days 1 through 5, and she's basically, no nice way to say it, there's tissue and clots and pieces coming out, that is her stratum functionalis being sloughed off and removed. Well, the second that's removed, the basalis has to undergo cell division to grow it back quickly, because if it doesn't, there's another egg potentially coming down the pipe that was fertilized. So she has to, basically the menstrual cycle becomes a massive deconstruction, reconstruction effort every 28 days. And God, my heart goes out to women who have to do this, because I'd be bitchy too every 28 days. I'm bitchy without it, So I don't need that on top of it. All right, so, but that's the endometrium. The endometrium you should know. All right, now, the uterus, understand, why do I say it's like crazy, ridiculously phenomenal? Understand, when a woman is not pregnant, it's literally about the size of a pear, a small pear. When she goes full-term pregnancy with 1 child, it's about the size of a basketball. And then in a matter after she gives birth, in about 2 weeks to 3 weeks, it shrinks back down to the size of a pear. That is crazy. You understand the ability to do that. It's the only tissue designed to do that, which means that if the embryo implants anywhere else out of the uterus, it's not going to survive. Like it's what's called an ectopic pregnancy. If, let's say, the cilia fail and the embryo implants here in the fallopian tube. Well, understand, embryos give off hormones which act very similar to tumors. They'll give off hormones which promote angiogenesis, meaning new blood vessels growing to the developing offspring and not to the area. That's what tumor cells do. But understand, in the uterus, it's designed to handle that and to expand. That tube isn't. So now when you have new blood vessels coming toward it, the fallopian tube, as the embryo starts to develop, gets bigger and bigger. What's going to happen to the tube? It's going to rip. And when it rips, all those blood vessels that were newly formed to it, they rip too. And she starts to bleed out internally. If an ectopic pregnancy occurs, your doctor has to go in. They have to cut out the fallopian tube, remove where the implantation was, and ligate that back together again so the fallopian tube will work. The offspring, basically, you really can't. There's potential, but normally you can't save that, because it's basically you're saving mom's life is what you're doing. All right, so uterus itself, understand, is going to be lined on the endometrium with a very thick layer of mucus continuously. That changes. When she's sexually aroused, it creates more mucus. Why is the mucus in there? Ladies, think this through. If you want to understand what your gynecologist sees whenever he does an internal on you, imagine looking down the neck of a 2-liter bottle, okay? The opening of the 2-liter bottle would be the opening of the vaginal orifice. The neck is the vagina, and then it opens up into this cavern. That's the uterus. That's essentially what you're looking at. Understand, think about that area. It's warm, it's dark, it's damp, and full of nutrients. It's a perfect incubator for all sorts of things to grow in. Last thing you want are things growing in you. So what do you need? Same thing I mentioned in the respiratory tree. You need mucus. It's basically a fly paper to catch anything. And in that flypaper, you have everything from lysozymes to Langerhans cells that basically destroy all that stuff so it never becomes a problem. That's why it's there. Now, when she, in her menstrual cycle, when she gets closer to the date of ovulation, this mucus layer will thin. Why? Because understand the mucus is an impedance for the oocyte coming down, but it's also an impedance for the sperm coming up. So basically, as she gets closer to ovulation, that 24 hours after ovulation, it thins to give the sperm a chance, to give the oocyte a chance to get fertilized. But then it'll grow back again, the mucus layer. All right. I think that's it for it. So you have to know the endometrium, uterus, and you got to know cervix, where it understand is going to be made up of stratified squamous epithelium. But remember, kind of like the inside of your cheek, it's non-keratinized, so therefore it always has to remain damp, again, for many reasons. One basically is to prevent infection. Now, however, the vaginal tissue itself just has no means to make the mucus. That has to come from the uterus itself coming on the way out. Plus, there's also what's called a Bartholian gland, which is also going to occur on the outside of the vulva, which actually lubricates from the outside in. So the vagina itself doesn't have the ability to produce that material. It's getting it from the inside out, from the outside in. That's how it stays damp. All right, now, the vagina itself, again, is meant as the birth canal. It's also the area for the insertion of the penis as well as for copulation. Now, inside of the vagina, there's actually ridges in here called frictional ridges called vaginal rugae. When the woman becomes sexually aroused, that area becomes engorged with blood, therefore it becomes tighter, which then facilitates ejaculation from the male quicker to promote fertilization. I'm trying to think if there's anything else about the vagina that you needed to know. One thing I mentioned, again, it's stratified squamous epithelium. Also, if you remember from the previous lecture, I said that the vagina is lovingly Hell's Cavern, because again, the pH inside the vagina is anywhere between 3.5 to 4, whereas inside the male, the sperm are at a nice little rosy pH of around 7.4. So once they're ejaculated, the acidity increases 1,000-fold. That'd be like me dropping you off on the surface of the sun, going, I'll be back in a second to pick you up, and poof, you're gone. That is the reason why the male, whenever he ejaculates, not only has the sperm, he has the semen. And as I said, the seminal vesicle is going to secrete an alkaline solution, basically to neutralize his urethra. However, from the Cowper's gland, bulbourethral gland, he also secretes another alkaline solution. That alkaline solution is to nullify the acidity of this area to give the sperm a chance of entry. Okay. Now, those are all considered essential organs for the female reproductive tract, meaning for the release of egg, fertilization, implantation, and birth. Now, the other ones you're still liable for that you have to know would be what are called the accessories, which would be the labia minora, the labia majora, and the clitoris. So, if you looked at, say, if I took this to the side, the uterus would kind of look like this, and then you had the vaginal orifice coming down, tilting dorsally. Okay. Now, on the way out, assume this is the front of her. The clitoris, well, first off, you'd have the labia minora right here, the labia majora on the outside. The labia minora, understand, was basically this tissue that made up the shaft in the male that never closed. It remains open. This labia majora was what made the tissue of the scrotum in the male, but again, it never closes to make the pouch. It stays open. The clitoris would be right about here, further up. Okay? Now, again, the clitoris acts like the glans penis, sensitive to sexual stimulation. Okay? Now, bear in mind, when you see the diagram of it on the side, in the back here, that's going to be the rectum. No. And then in the front, then, you're also going to have the bladder here coming down to the urethra. No. You don't want the one in front, don't want the one in back, you want the one in the middle, right there. Okay? That's going to be then the vagina. All right, so again, recap for the female reproductive tract, you got to know ovary, fimbriae, and fundulum. The fallopian tube, also known as oviduct, uterine tube, uterus, endometrium, cervix, vagina, and then you got to know clitoris, labia minora, labia majora. Okay. Now, let's see. I think we hit everything. The vulva basically is saying everything that's the external genitalia A lot of it I already talked about. It's going to be the labia majora, the labia minora, the clitoris. The vestibule means when the labia majora closes, everything that's contained within that area, which would also be the hole to the urethra, the hole to the vagina. If she still has her hymen, then it would also include that too, which is the blockage of that area prior to first penetration. Or if she rides horses or does gymnastics, it burst probably a long time ago. All right, flip then. We'll go to, as I said, on a hymen. Now notice, you saw my picture. That's the correct one. I'm thinking pretty close. No. Anyway, so
no.
As far as the hormones, I list the hormones that happen in the female. Again, the same hormones, same areas they come from, and in the male, but minus the testosterone, obviously. But again, the only one that's going to do something, GnRH still comes from our hypothalamus. GnRH still stimulates the anterior pituitary gland, still gives off FSH and LH. However, in the male, as I said, that's done on a steady, low process. In the female, it goes on a cycle, which is why it's the menstrual cycle, 28 days. And luteinizing, every 14 days is going to spike. All right, so you should know the importance of estrogen and what it does. Progesterone, if you remember so estrogen, we said, it gives her a secondary sexual traits. However, if you remember when I was going over the endometrium, I said there's two layers, the functionalis and the basalis. Whenever she goes through menses, blood flow to the functionalis ceases and basically dislodges the functionalis to go into menses, her heavy days of her menstrual cycle. However, like I said, after that's done, in the next 8 days, it has to be grown back as fast as possible. That's all done with estrogen. Estrogen, I said, promotes the cell cycle, promotes cell division. It promotes that to grow back. So estrogen does a lot of things besides just, breasts and wide hips, and it does a lot with that. Okay, so it promotes cell cycle. Progesterone, big star, very important. Progesterone maintains the structural integrity of the endometrium when it's attached to the uterus, meaning it can't pull off, it can't slough off. Therefore, it holds it to the wall. Now, understand, in the second half of the menstrual cycle, once the egg potentially is fertilized, number one, you want to make sure that endometrium is nice and fluffy and filled with blood, just in case something has to implant. Even more importantly, you want to make sure it doesn't pull off the walls of the uterus. So the estrogen is what's going to prime that endometrium to become thicker and become a healthy environment for implantation. Progesterone holds it, keeps it to the wall. Both hormones are going to come out of the corpus luteum, which I said earlier, okay? The yellow body. Now, menstrual cycle. Menstrual cycle, again, as I said, on average, is 28 days, give or take. Now, that means that day 14, halfway through, is the big day ovulation. So a lot of textbooks will say anything before day 14 is pre-ovulatory, after that's post-ovulatory. That's one way to look at it. A more detailed way to look at it, the one I want you to notice, days 1 through 13 are often called the follicular phase. Okay, follicular phase means a little more than just pre-ovulatory. Okay, follicular phase is going to be broken down into two separate phases. Days 1 through 5 is called menstruation. That's when you're removing the previous month's stratum functionalis. Days 6 through 13 are going to be called the proliferative phase, meaning that what was lost with estrogen has to be grown back very rapidly. Okay, so days 1 through 5, menses, menstruation. What's going to happen? Now think, previous month, what had happened? The stratum functionalis became nice and thick and full of blood, and new blood vessels have come to it. We don't need them anymore. So what happens? Her corpus luteum in the ovary becomes the corpus albicans. It degenerates. Now you're not getting estrogen, you're not getting progesterone. What does that do? That causes blood vessels going toward that previous month's functionalis to essentially rupture. Progesterone, then lack of progesterone, lets that wall come off, and literally that stratum functionalis sloughs off in the first 5 days, and that's the heavy days. Okay? Now, that is going to be the uterine event. At the same time, an ovarian event is going to be happening, because remember, you're not pregnant. So what happens? FSH comes a knocking. FSH is released, going to start picking out ovarian follicles and go, today's your day, let's get up and running again. Okay? Now, in the proliferative phase, Again, the uteral event would mean that the stratum basalis now has to go through division to make a new stratum functionalis in about 8 days. Fast as possible, because if that oocyte gets fertilized, it needs a place to implant. All right, now, at the same time, in the proliferative phase, what's happening in the ovary? That's whenever I said the primary follicle is going, it goes from prophase 1. It goes through meiosis 1. It goes to metaphase 2 and stops. You now form a Graafian follicle. That's all going to be the ovarian event in the proliferative phase. Now we come to day 14. Day 14 is ovulation. As I said, luteinizing hormone shows up. It literally spikes. And when it spikes, it causes the Graafian follicle to rupture, releasing the secondary oocyte in metaphase 2 into the fallopian tube. Okay? Now, once that happens, LH, I said, then takes that broken Graafian follicle, makes it reseal, and now it becomes the corpus luteum. Luteum again because it makes estrogen progesterone. What does estrogen do? It talks to her uterus saying, grow more tissue, more vascularized, get ready, just in case. The progesterone keeps it the integrity of the entire area, just in case. Okay? So that's all day 14. Now, days 15 through 28 in her menstrual cycle runs pretty much like clockwork. It's the most stable time period of it. Basically runs like a machine from that point on. At this phase, we have what is called the secretory phase and the luteal phase. Luteal phase alluding to the corpus luteum, giving off progesterone and estrogen, like I was saying earlier. The secretory phase means that the lining, the endometrium, becomes very thick and vascularized, looking almost like a gland, like it should secrete, but it's also secreting materials just in case there is implantation to promote implantations. That's the secretory phase. If she's not pregnant, what happens? She doesn't need a corpus luteum anymore. It becomes the corpus albicans. The stratum functionalis detaches, start the whole thing all over again. If she is impregnated, well, that's a different ballgame. So usually in my notes I put, well, congratulations. Maybe, maybe not. Mazel tov, I don't know. L'chaim, whatever. Anyway, so what happens? When the embryo, which is now going to be in the blastocyst stage, implants, the outside layer of it, which I'll talk about in my last lecture with you, is going to secrete a hormone called HCG. HCG, big star, stands for human chorionic gonadotropin. Biochemically, it basically mimics luteinizing hormone. So follow. That means then luteinizing hormone, days 1 through 12, is very low. It'll spike, then come back down, and then go back the rest of the way. If she's impregnated, as the luteinizing hormone is coming down, remember the luteinizing hormone made the corpus luteum, said, stay around, we still need you. If she's impregnated, HCG will then start to take its place, and therefore will mimic luteinizing hormone. So therefore, HCG biochemically looks like luteinizing hormone, will then communicate to the corpus luteum going, no, don't go anywhere, don't become the albicans, we need you here a little while longer, and just keep giving us estrogen progesterone. That is now the communication from the blastocyst and then eventually the gastrula to mommy, so that there's that biochemical connection. When a woman goes for when she does a home pregnancy test, what she's looking for is concentrations of HCG in her urine. HCG doesn't come from daddy, doesn't come from mommy. It comes from one place only. The actual embryo, the gastrula, and then the fetus eventually. When women go, well, how come I got a false positive, false negative? Well, understand, if you take the test too early, you still have residual luteinizing hormone that hasn't been passed out of your system yet. And it acts just like HCG. So if you were to urinate on the home pregnancy test and you had luteinizing hormone, the kit wouldn't know the difference between HCG and luteinizing hormone. It would think it's the same thing. Oh, you're pregnant, but you're not. That's why they tell you to wait. And the longer you wait after you're being late, the more truer the results are. Gentlemen, can you get a positive for being a home pregnancy kit? Yes, you can. If you urinate on a home pregnancy kit type stick thing and it becomes out positive, red flag, that's a precursor of testicular cancer. What that means is that you're overproducing luteinizing hormone and it's coming out in your urine, which could be an early warning sign or a sign of testicular cancer. So you're not pregnant, you don't have the plumbing for that, but you have another thing to consume your attention. All right, now with that finishes the female anatomy and the menstrual cycle. My last lecture is going to cover then a shakedown of genetics and going over some Punnett squares to hopefully give you the warm fuzzies that you're going to be okay on doing genetic problems.